You're listening to Nothing's New on GNAT-TV, a historical podcast connecting the past to the present with Paige Vignola, Shawn Harrington, and Andrew McKeever. Hello and welcome back to Nothing's New, our podcast where we look at historical events and their influence on the present. It's rare that anything that happens today is completely unprecedented. Something, somewhere, some time ago was similar in form or content, or both. I'm Andrew McKeever, and I'm honored to be joined today by my fellow podsters, Paige Vignola, the Assistant Director of the Manchester Community Library, and Shawn Harrington, the Curator of the Manchester Historical Society. It's been a while since we've been back here at GNAT and doing a podcast, so it's really good to be back with you both here to kind of, get back up to speed here on what happened a few hundred years ago and connect it to the present. So we did, as many of you will remember, a series on the 250th commemoration that is, of course, still an ongoing event. It'll be a 3-year-long program from now until 2027. But today we're going to kind of have a look at the Alien and Sedition Acts. That was legislation that was passed by the U.S. Congress in 1798. There were a total of 4 U.S. statutes that sought on national security grounds to restrict immigration and limit First Amendment protections of freedom of speech. They were endorsed by the Federalist Party of President John Adams as a response to a developing dispute with the French Republic and to related fears of domestic political subversion. The prosecution of journalists under the Sedition Act rallied public support for opposition Democratic Republicans, that was the other political party of the time, and contributed to their success in the elections of 1800. Under the new administration of Thomas Jefferson, only the Alien Enemies Act, granting the president powers of detention and deportation of foreigners in wartime or in face of a threatened invasion, remained in force. So there were 4 of these Alien and Sedition Acts that were passed in 1798 by the Congress that year. One was the Naturalization Act that increased the requirements to seek citizenship, the Alien Friends Act that allowed the president to imprison and deport foreigners, the Sedition Act of 1798 that criminalized false and or malicious statements about the federal government that was voted out in 1800, and then the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 that gave the president additional powers to detain foreigners during the times of war, invasion, or predatory incursion. I guess just real quick, that Alien Enemies Act has only been put in place 3 times since it was enacted. One was in the War of 1812, then again in the 20th century twice in the First and Second Wars, and that was that in the Second World War, that was the Alien Enemies Act is best known as the legal authority behind the internment of German Americans during both World Wars, actually, and as the internment of Italian Americans and Japanese Americans during World War II. Well, let me stop there. Paige, you, as our historical scholar here, have done the deep dive into the sort of the historical background of all of this, and you can take us back into the Middle Ages and where this all may have begun.
So it's a tenuous connection. I'm not going to lie about that. It's definitely a tenuous connection because in the medieval period, you definitely have acts of treason. And again, it's kind of hard to accuse a foreigner of treason, right? So in order to be able to be accused of treason, you actually have to be a citizen of or a resident of, or a permanent resident of, so to speak, of that country. Obviously the job of a spy has existed for, millennia, right? I mean, like it's written out in the Art of War, right? Sun Tzu's Art of War has a variety of different types of spies, right? In the medieval period, spying is kind of interesting because it's not, early on, it's not really a specific job description of a spy, right? You more have diplomats, right? People who are courtiers or court hangers-on, who are present in the foreign courts and listening to basically court gossip, right? I'm like, what are people talking about? And reporting that back. It becomes a little bit more problematic, obviously, anytime there is some kind of foreign conflict, right? Say, for example, when the English were warring against the Scots, which was kind of always. But one of the more famous situations in which an individual was accused of, I guess, spying, although technically the word spy didn't really come about. A spy was a scout, same thing as you would be like in a military conflict, right? You'd be a scout, you'd be looking ahead, right? And it was not, spying wasn't really considered treason at that point, and we know that based on Sir Thomas Tuberville's, the punishment that was allotted to him after he was accused of spying. That was in the reign of Edward I. We're talking late 13th century, like 1290 something or other.
Going way back.
Yes, but because he was actually, I mean, there was probably some beef going on between Sir Thomas and King Edward, because he seemed really kind of gleeful about the information that he was passing on to the provost of Paris. And he was actually executed for espionage when he was caught. But the reason why you can tell that him being executed as a spy is not the same thing as treason is because of the way that he was executed. He was actually, I mean, it was kind of lenient, right? I mean, he wasn't quartered or disemboweled or burnt or beheaded or any of the other things that would happen to traitors. He was just executed. He was hanged. So again, so that demonstrates that he wasn't looked at as a traitor. He was just a spy. It's a little bit later on, we have kind of during the pickup of the Wars of the Roses, where that sort of changes a bit. Sorry, excuse me, not the Wars of the Roses, the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War, of course, is the 116-year conflict that was between the Crown of England and the Crown of France over who had supremacy, who had the right to claim lands, territorial lands on the continent, what would be now considered the French continent. And this was kind of interesting, and it was a lot easier for the English to be spies than it was for the French to be spies. Bear in mind that, again, in the 14th century, the dominant language in the English court was French. You can't really be a spy unless you can hide, right? You got to be able to hide in plain sight. And so you have a number of high-ranking English officials, or in fact, people who were kind of just sort of installed as, you know, like they were merchants and they were just kind of hanging out and listening to gossip. But you can't really be a spy unless you are fluent in the language of the court that you're at, right? So since French was the dominant language in the English court, it was easier for the English to be in the French court and listening to court gossip, and then reporting that gossip back. There was basically nowhere else in the world until the English kind of really started expanding out and creating their, the English Empire, one upon which the sun never sets. There was really nowhere else in the world where English was a dominant language that was spoken. So nobody was speaking English well enough to be able to disguise their accents, to be able to be hiding out, embedded in English politics. So it's kind of interesting along those lines. But anyway, so it becomes a bigger deal, this whole spying sort of situation. And around the 1380s, I guess, is that, no, 1340s, let's say. So when we have the first attack of the 100 Years' War, which was a naval battle, there's indications that there was a spy network kind of going back and forth trading information. And then at that time, this is Edward III, who is the king, anybody who was considered suspect, right? Anybody who maybe would have been considered a foreign national was automatically kind of watched. And foreign ports were, ports were closed down to foreigners coming in or out. Baggage would be searched, people coming in and out of the country. We're looking for incriminating correspondence, right, that sort of thing. Bear in mind that obviously with no telephones or any of that sort of stuff, and any word that's going to be passed on is going to be passed on verbally or in a written form. And so there was a lot more control over boarding houses. Interestingly, there was control over suspicion of French monasteries, French monks who were installed in monasteries. But the Newgate prison was reported to be full of spies in 1345, right? And that's right around the Gascon campaign in the 100 Years' War. And then again in 1380, during the Breton campaign, Newgate prison was reported to be full of spies. Interestingly enough, however, there's no evidence found that any of these prisoners were brought before magistrates in order to actually be tried. They were just sort of rounded up, kind of like the German, Italian, and Japanese internment camps, right? They're just kind of rounded up and kind of kept in secluded locations, again, Newgate Prison for one of them. It is not until probably about the mid-15th century, so 1440, late 1430s, 1440s, around that period, when there had been a lot of setbacks in the 100 Years' War. Early on, the English had been doing very well. I think we're probably all most of us familiar with, the battles of Edward III and then his son, the Black Prince. There was another setback during Richard. But then we have, Henry IV, Henry V, who were, military successes on the continent. But then things started kind of falling by the wayside when Henry VI came to the throne. And so therefore there was a big kind of setback for the 100 Years' War, and the English started hating foreigners again, right? Because when you start doing poorly in a war, you start getting really kind of antsy about the people that you're fighting against. So that antipathy was kind of directed towards the Flemish and the French, and of course always the Scots. There's always the Scots. And so they started doing things like curbing the number of foreign merchants who were allowed into the country, right? Then they developed what they called the alien subsidies, which is kind of where I'm saying this loose kind of connection comes in. And the alien subsidies were taxes that were placed on non-native born people who were residing in England, anybody who was over the age of 12. There were exemptions to that at that. It sounds awkward to say so, but the Welsh were exempted from that only because they had been, according to the English crown, fully dominated by about 1413. And so therefore, any alien women who were married to either English or Welsh husbands were exempted from that tax. And anybody who had basically purchased what would be the equivalent of like a permanent residency were also exempted from that tax. The tax, as you can imagine, as taxes frequently are, was not popular. It didn't really last past, I think, 1490, maybe a little bit earlier than that. So that's kind of like your rundown. That's sort of extending a little bit out of the medieval period, but that's kind of like your basic rundown, right? I mean, in the sense that, there was a distinction between treason and espionage, and it was codified. And then, again, you also have this sense of controlling resident aliens, really, and how are you going to handle a resident alien of a country with which you are in conflict?
So all of which had John Adams and his Federalist partners a little twitchy at that point in 1798. But there was a problem with the act, just to kind of fast forward back to the 1790s, grew out of a problem that the U.S. government had with the French, who had been their allies in the Revolutionary War.
Oh, yeah.
An important reason why they won in the first place. That I guess.
Well, it was a different government. I mean, let's
Right.
be fair. That's a different government between 1798
That's the monarchy versus post-monarchy, post pre-Napoleon, I guess. Napoleon wasn't yet on the scene, was he, by that point? Oh, I can't remember. But anyway, there was the French government was no longer providing money to the U.S. government, or is bailing out on loans and something like that.
Well, that was that was one of the major complaints of the French Revolution, is the fact that the French crown had spent so much money funding the American Revolution that it had bankrupted the people. Obviously, it didn't bankrupt all of the people. In fact, my daughter and I were just in Paris, and as we're wandering around Versailles, it's like, oh, I totally understand the revolution now. Yeah. Oh, no, I get it. No, I absolutely get it.
This is quite a nice building, wasn't it? Well, Shawn, let's bring you into this, because there's a bit of a local connection going on here as well, isn't there? Matthew Lyon, the founder of Fairhaven, and has many other claims to fame. He was swept up in all of this Alien and Sedition Act mania of 1798.
Yeah, I mean, going back to what did our government look like then? I mean, it was Federalists, which Adams represented, and then of course one of his biggest critics was Thomas Jefferson, who was his vice president,
Right.
And and so the act didn't protect the vice president, by the way, but Jefferson was very played his cards pretty tight. I mean, a lot of his was letters. He wasn't really too much of an orator. He had a very soft-spoken voice, but he definitely had a lot of people who read his writings and were students of what his general thoughts. And Lyon came here from Ireland, and he was an indentured servant when he first arrived in Connecticut. And when he finally, when that tenure was over, he came up here to the Grants and settled in Arlington in the mid-1770s and met up with, the Allens. He became a Green Mountain Boy. I am actually wearing my Descendants of the Green Mountain Boys t-shirt today because I'm actually
hip.
go back that far, believe it or not, my family. It's like, whoa. And he actually married Thomas Chittenden's daughter, and, Chittenden was, our first governor,
Right.
and, navigated us through that whole, during much of the time that we were our own republic. So, the whole idea that Lyon would, be kind of lashing out against, the Green Mountain Boys, local control, anti-aristocracy, liberty from tyranny. I mean, these were all the seedlings. And then when he went up to Fairhaven, in this early 1780, 1783. I just love the name of this. He actually he founded a newspaper called The Scourge of Aristocracy and Repository of Important Political Truth.
Now, I'm trying to picture that one on the top of A1.
It's The Scourge.
Right.
Come on. Like, have you read The Scourge? Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's opposed to the Times or the Tribune, right?
So,
Where you can,
so he wasn't trying to, there was no reading between the lines. So, as you could imagine, he being, more of a Jeffersonian Republican who, kind of really believed in the smaller government, limited size, narrowly defined versus the Federalists who, wanted a strong central government and, military, and they were pro-British, and, the Jeffersonians were a little more pro-French, and, there was it's too hard to get into in a soundbite, but there were a lot of conflicts. So, he had this platform which, put him, he was right in the target. And he was kind of made an example, I think. He was imprisoned up in Vergennes, Vermont. He'd been elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from Vermont, 1797 to 1801, and, spent 4 months in jail. And he was actually reelected while he was in jail because he continued writing while he was in jail. And it was really kind of almost a rallying cry.
Only in Vermont, right?
It's just like, it really is just, a sign of the times for them. And later on, he also, having that spirit that he did, he famously, he spit. And the Federalist Roger Griswold, who had criticized his military, what's the word I'm looking for here? I'm drawing a blank. See, I'm starting to get old. His military service, which most of the House, and they were all veterans of the Revolutionary War, and he was highly insulted. So, and this was back in the days when everybody chewed tobacco on the floor, and he spat right in his face.
Ooh, not nice at all.
And they had to be restrained. And then later, there was another brawl between the two of them when when Griswold started attacking him with a cane, and Lyon defended himself with a pair of fireplace tongs that were in the House chamber.
When people say politics today are ugly, it's like, really though, really?
They would never do that today, would they? That wouldn't happen.
I think now they just say, my distinguished colleague, which
who doesn't know anything
on the other side of the aisle. But yeah, so a very fascinating, fascinating figure and controversial. He, I guess you would say that's not exactly the behavior you'd want from one of your elected representatives. But on the flip side to that, there's somebody who say, well, he has passion.
Right.
Right. It was from Ireland, and I don't want to stereotype here.
Uh-oh, here we go.
He was a Green Mountain Boy, so yeah, he was not afraid to, he wasn't afraid to back down, and, had his opinions. And again, I just come back to the name of the paper. So, and then later on he moved to Kentucky, and, where he was also active in politics there. And, later on, there was some issues because, with his legacy, because he did have enslaved people while he was in Kentucky. But, his time here in Vermont was really best known as him being a Green Mountain Boy and, being thrown in jail for 4 months, being fined, and then being reelected while he was in jail. So it was a little poke in the eye to Mr. Adams.
So I just pulled up what it was he was thrown in jail for. He apparently printed an editorial which included charges that Adams had a, quote, an unbounded thirst for ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and selfish avarice, as well as an accusation that Adams had corrupted the Christian religion to further his war aims. That was pretty heavy stuff. I can imagine back in the late 18th century that would have had a lot of people shaking and shouting, wouldn't it? Maybe it would today, too.
Yeah.
So
selfish avarice. Unbounded thirst for ridiculous pomp. Yeah, I mean, what do they? I mean, there was some references of Adams wanting to be a king.
Oh,
And
yeah,
that was-
frequently. And
Yeah.
also, I don't think that was the only time Adams was referred to as pompous.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So it was in October 1798 that he was convicted, fined $1,000, which $1,000 was
That's a
Yeah,
lot.
that's a lot of money
That's a
back
lot
then.
of money.
It's a lot of money
And,
now,
you know,
but
and,
back then that was.
spent some time in the jail up there in Vergennes, Vermont. So
I do find some delicious irony, however, in the fact that the acts were actually signed on July 14th. I mean, because this was, 9 years to the day after Bastille Day, right? I mean, so you're talking like the biggest celebration in France, and, because of the conflict with France, they're signing in these Alien and Sedition Acts. I think that there's some really class timing on that.
So I was thinking that the fact that 3 of the 4 Alien and Sedition Acts were basically repealed or overturned within, I think two were taken out within, but in 1800, and a third was removed in 1802. So this was a very political thing. The Democrat and Republicans came back into power. Thomas Jefferson was president, although, of course, the election of 1800 is a classic one where, it makes kind of our last couple of elections look like, no big deal, because that was the elections were decided by the House of Representatives.
right. Yeah, and the Federalists. I mean, you have to realize that. I mean, it's just again, it's one of those cases where Adams wanted to suppress his opponents, and what he did was actually he ignited and the fire burned brighter.
Well, yeah,
Because
what,
it really-
5 out of 6 of the Republican papers were tried for libel. I mean, like, that's
Right.
pretty, that's pretty significant.
Right. So, it's like the more you try to squash it, it's almost like, that spirit which, was alive then and is still alive now. That's why, and has been alive at all those periods in time. I mean, even during the Civil War, when Lincoln, basically, he suspended habeas corpus. I mean, there were people who weren't, who took him to task for that. I mean, today we kind of think of him in such reverence, but there were a lot of things that he did that, people were like, you can't do that, including, at the time, the Supreme Court Justice, Justice Taney, which is a fascinating story, and I'm going way off topic, so
That's
I'm
okay.
just going to reel it right back in.
We'll have to
again.
come back to that one, though.
And, but I mean, it really, trying to punish dissent and, to criminalize political opposition, what happened was, Jefferson won. And the Sedition Act expired the day before Jefferson took office, so.
It's convenient.
Yeah, and I mean, and obviously it led to that rift, the deeper rift between Adams and Jefferson, who, very famously ended up later in life kind of, I don't know if you could say they rekindled the friendship, but they certainly rekindled their communications, through letters, and then both died on the 4th of July.
On the 4th of July.
Just a few hours apart from one another.
So I guess this is one example of the tension between big picture national security concerns and individual rights. On the other hand, I guess can we see it as a conflict between those two things?
I mean, a conflict of that, but I mean, I think there was also just trying to, I think it really comes down to just trying to squash dissent, through freedom of speech. And, well, I don't like what you said, so I'm going to throw you in jail, or I'm going to sue you. Or, I mean, these are all, the freedom of the press. Andrew is a man who's, been a journalist for, so many years. I mean, I'm sure probably, if you were back in 1797, I'm sure there's some pieces you wrote that maybe you'd be sitting in the clink. No?
Well, there are also some more nefarious levels as well, right? I mean, I'm not talking right or wrong
The
here,
slanderous, yeah.
but when you have, Thomas Jefferson, who is actually hiring operatives in order to be able to, conduct smear campaigns in the press. I mean, I think from the Adams perspective, there's probably a sense of, how dare you speak that way about me? And again, I'm not in any way, shape, or form trying to say that suppressing one's right to free speech is correct. But I mean, Jefferson knew what he was doing. I mean, that was very intentional to draw disparagement upon Adams.
Yeah, and if you have a newspaper called The Scourge of Aristocracy and the Repository of Important Political Truth, you have an axe to grind.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, whether or not he was on the right side of history, I mean, now we're sitting here talking about it, but,
Of course, that puts it a really interesting perspective in the fact that after 1800, of course, Adams and Jefferson sort of eventually found their way back to being at least pen pals again, right?
Right.
and they wrote letters back and forth to each other, and found that there was a certain amount of common ground between them, and at least they weren't like kind of threatening to throw each other in jail or something like that, and then wound up, of course, both dying on the same day.
Yeah.
July 4th, 1824, I think.
You're out of my time
Somewhere
period.
in the 1820s anyway, but quite a fascinating kind of thing. Well, yeah, it's interesting that until the present moment, that Alien Act, the one surviving act, has only been applied in wartime.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that at the time, really, the Sedition Acts were the ones that were being implemented frequently, and that the Alien Enemies Act really was never put to use because the climate in the country had become so rancorous towards the French that anybody who was of French descent had pretty much picked up and moved out. And so I did a little bit of digging. I didn't do a whole lot of digging because, again, not my time period, but I don't think there were any instances in which anyone was prosecuted under the Alien Enemies Act at that point.
Yeah.
Again, maybe I'm wrong.
No,
Correct me if I
think
am.
you're correct, yeah.
So really, the Sedition Acts were the ones that were the big players at the time.
Well, an interesting chapter in our country's history because, when we look around today and see politics that seem to be so toxic, it's good to remember that, in 1800, it was a lot worse.
History. Well, history repeats itself.
Yeah, nothing's new,
Right.
Andrew. Nothing's
Nothing's
new.
Well, a good place to leave it, I guess, at least for now. But I want to thank you all for being with us, and thanks to Paige and Shawn for being here as well, and contributing their profound insights. And thanks for you to be listening and watching. And we'll do this again another time. So, what are we going to talk about next time?
Well, we can't say, because what if we talk about it?
Hmm?
I said we better not mention it just in case we end up not talking about it.
Oh, that's true.
There are so
So
many
stay
topics.
tuned.
It's hard to pick.
I know. Well, we'll come up with something. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody.
All right, thank you, Andrew.
We'll see you the next
Thanks,
time.
Paige.